In one of its strongest signs of support for Ukraine, the US and its NATO allies have pledged billions of dollars in military aid as the conflict nears the one-year mark. On Friday, the US and NATO countries announced that huge shipments of heavy weapons would be sent to Ukraine, including air defenses and armored vehicles. The US said it alone would commit 500 Bradley Figthing Vehicles as Ukraine remains locked in heavy fighting in its eastern regions. But Kiev didn't get everything it wanted. Friday's NATO meeting ended without guarantees that Germany would give permission to send its Leopard 2 tanks. But on Sunday, Germany's foreign minister said her government would not stand in the way of Poland's desire to send the Leopard 2s to Ukraine. Pressure is mounting on Berlin to deliver the tanks to Ukraine, with Poland's prime minister suggesting he could send them without German approval. Meanwhile, the Speaker of Russia's parliament warned that countries supplying Ukraine with more lethal weapons would force Moscow to retaliate. And to further discuss the latest arms shipments to Ukraine, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is William Courtney. He is the former U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia, and also a fellow at the RAND Corporation. And by Mohamed Kochak, he's a Russian foreign policy analyst, joining me from Ankara. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. So, William, how will NATO's pledge to send more advanced weaponry to Ukraine play out? Is this a significant move?
Yes, what has taken place recently is that the United States and several other allies are providing infantry fighting vehicles. Those are important for Ukraine to conduct counteroffensives to retake land that the Russians took at the beginning of the war. And then tanks are likely to be coming. Germany has been reluctant thus far, but it looks like that's going to be changing.
So, Mohamed, Ukrainian President Zelensky has said the transfer of dozens of tanks from the West will not solve the problem, since Russia has 1,000 tanks. What's your take on that? Is he right?
Well, if Ukraine wants to win this fight, of course, he's right. I mean, Ukraine needs more tanks. However, whether the West, and particularly Germany, is going to be able to keep supplying Ukraine with more tanks is the question. Well, I'm not sure if that is going to occur in any time soon. However, well, I'm also thinking, well, months before this, or even weeks before this, right, the West started to supply weapons to Ukraine, kind of weapons to Ukraine that it wasn't ready to supply months before that. So, well, depending on the escalation of the war, in the upcoming months, we may see the West supplying more tanks to the Ukraine. However, as Zelensky is saying, if the Ukraine is going to match Russia's war efforts, of course, Ukraine needs more tanks, because that's essential.
So, William, why are tanks so crucial in the Ukraine conflict? Could they be a game changer if sent by the Germans?
They won't be a game changer, but they will be critically important for counteroffensives. For defensive actions, tanks are not so important, whereas defensive actions rely on barriers, on entrenched equipment in the ground, for example, artillery. But for offense, combined arms operations are necessary, using infantry, armor, artillery, and aviation. Using them together. NATO is now training Ukrainians on how to do combined arms operations in Germany. Tanks are a key part of that for the forward thrust.
So, Mohamed, what would be the military fallout from this assistance? Is it likely to escalate the conflict, or is it going to change the course of the conflict?
Well, that's what Russians are saying. Russians keep saying that, well, if you supply Ukraine with more weapons, well, we are going to escalate the war and we are going to enter into a vicious cycle. So what Russia is saying, particularly Putin is saying that, well, if you supply Ukraine with more weapons, more tanks, more drones, more this, more that, and we are going to match this quickly and easily, and you are going to have this war forever. Well, in its essence, actually, what Russia is saying here is that, well, we are going to win this war, whatever it costs. So just don't make this costly for Ukraine and for Europe. Well, on the contrary, what Europe and the West is saying, well, this war for Ukraine is winnable, so we need to supply more weapons. That's the basis of the discussion here, actually.
So, William, you have briefly mentioned, but why are the US and Germany are reluctant to send their most advanced tanks to Ukraine? I mean, what's at stake for both countries?
U.S. tanks are not particularly appropriate for Ukraine. They are maintenance intensive. They require jet fuel to run because of the gas turbine engine. And the supply chain for those kinds of tanks is particularly complicated. Leopard tanks, the Germans are excellent tanks. They rely on diesel, which is widely available in Ukraine. And they are better suited. They're lighter weight. They're better suited for conditions in Ukraine. And Leopard tanks are possessed by over a dozen countries in Europe, many of which are willing to provide those tanks to Ukraine.
So is this really the case, I mean, from the standpoint of technicality? Because some argue that the U.S. is dragging its feet because it doesn't want to divert key weapons from delicate regions like Taiwan and Korea. Would you agree?
That's not correct. Tanks in Taiwan, for example, are not particularly important.
All right. So what's your take on that, Mohammed? Why is Germany reluctant in committing to providing Ukraine with these tanks? I mean, what's the German position there? I mean, is there any historic reasoning behind that?
Well, Germans' declared position is that, well, Germans are saying that, well, we are ready to supply Ukraine with more tanks, particularly Leopard tanks, which are, as the ambassador saying, is not as hard to function in the Ukrainian terrain. It's not costly to run. But the Germans are also saying, well, we are ready to supply this, but we don't want to take the lead in this. So what they're saying is that, well, the US should go first, and then we'll continue. We will follow. But I'm not sure if that is sensible, in the sense that, well, what is going to change if the US is going to supply or not? I mean, I don't see any kind of change in the dynamics within which enables the supply of German tanks to Ukraine.
Okay.
Why they are not doing this? Well, there might be strategic reasons. Well, obviously, the Germans do not want to lead this fight against Ukraine. They fear that they end up becoming a cannon fodder in the fight between Russia and the United States. So that's what they're trying to do, I guess.
So, well, then Poland's prime minister has said if Germany doesn't approve their transfer, Poland will make its own decisions regardless. Is the transfer of Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine driving a wedge between Germany and Poland?
It does not appear to be a serious wedge. The Poles have said they're going to request permission from Germany. The German foreign minister has said Germany would not object to Poland sending Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. And Germany itself seems to be now moving forward with regard to providing Leopard 2 tanks itself. It is said that the final decision has not been made, but the various signals seem to suggest that Germany might have more flexibility.
As a former diplomat, I want to ask you this as well. Why do you think high-level officials lately have been suggesting Ukraine to recapture Crimea? Is it an easy task? And with this aid, will Ukraine be equipped well enough to cut off Russia's supply lines and maybe isolate Crimea?
Seizing Crimea militarily will be a challenging task. Ukraine does not have large-scale combat amphibious capability to assault Crimea from the sea, and there is a narrow isthmus between Ukraine's main land and the Crimea Peninsula. Russia can block that with not too much trouble. It is possible for Ukraine to seize Crimea, but it would be quite difficult.
So, Mohammed, since the start of the conflict, NATO countries have provided some $40 billion in weaponry to Ukraine, which is roughly the size of France's annual defense budget. So has there been a miscalculation on NATO's side?
I'm not sure about that. I think it's well worth it. If we look at the issue from the United States side, well, they are weakening Russia, that's for sure. Russia is under economic sanctions. Russia is fighting in Ukraine, it's kind of in an endless fight. If we think the issue from this perspective, well, yes, it's well worth. I mean, you put some money, you are weakening Russia, and you are not fighting yourself. The Ukrainians are fighting. However, if they are thinking that, well, I mean, if they thought that, well, with this much money we should have won this war, well, I'm not sure about this.
So, William, Ukraine says enough with the defensive weapons. We need more offensive weapons. So would a fresh offensive from both Russia and Ukraine, which is likely to take place in spring, impact the already fragile energy supplies and rising prices across the globe?
The markets seem to have adjusted considerably since the beginning of the war. For example, some energy prices in Europe have gone down. So a renewed fight, if you will, of an offensive by each side probably wouldn't have that much impact on inflation or energy prices in the world.
So you don't believe that intensified fighting, which is expected between the two countries, also affect the grain deal?
It could affect the grain deal, but Russia has been dragging its feet. There are dozens of ships ready to take grain out, which Russia is not allowed to be inspected yet. So it's not clear a new fight would have an impact on that because it's already been a problem. However, some ships are moving forward.
So, Mohammed, where does Turkey stand amid the NATO decision? Is it getting even harder for Ankara to maintain the balance between the West and Russia?
I don't think it is. I mean, from the very beginning, Ankara has adopted a position that I could summarize as a pro-Ukrainian neutrality. Turkey hasn't recognized the annexed territories in Ukraine by Russia, supported Ukraine very much financially and militarily, especially with the Bayraktar drones. But Turkey is also trying to facilitate peace by trying to hold negotiations in Turkey multiple times. Well, as far as I am following, and I'm following it pretty closely, all sides, including NATO, United States, and European leaders are appreciating Turkey's efforts. I mean, no one is saying that Turkey is becoming a pro-Russian or pro-war or whatever. I mean, we see here and there some comments and opinion pieces, but I don't think that we see any kind of discord between NATO and Turkey regarding Turkey's decision or policy vis-a-vis the conflict.
So, William, for how long do you think Western allies continue to support Ukraine? I mean, will this become another frozen conflict in the region, or the West tends to keep it alive until Moscow backs down?
It is difficult to predict what could happen. There are a lot of options. It could persist, the conflict, for some time. It's possible that Ukraine will win the conflict or that the Russian army will collapse, because the Russian army has suffered huge losses thus far. There are other possibilities. I think that the key thing is that the West is determined to help Ukraine fight to retake its own territory so that aggression by Russia is not rewarded. Russia's economy is 25 times smaller than that of the West. I think the Russians will have some difficulty with a long conflict.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.